Basic idea of developmental stages, aka levels, waves, or my personal preference, layers, is ultra simplistic. This piquant proposal stipulates a general set of phases of growth characterizing human individuals and human societies, just as we see in the flowers, bees, and the buzzing history of the cosmos. We seem to be very comfortable with caterpillars becoming butterflies, trees expanding in rungs, and tiny infants turning into toddlers. But Christ, how far can this notion be incautiously extended out into the choppy waters of naturalism before the risk of drowning trumps everything? Two important questions need to be faced. One, how much of the universe can be described in a developmental fashion? I.e., which phenomena do and do not become more intelligible when characterized as contexts producing and becoming enfolded by other contexts? And two, when is it valid to think of phase-like phenomenon as a progress in capacity, a evolution, rather than merely a local set of adaptive modes, or evolution? I don't know the answers. Hopefully, I'm not being merely vain in believing that I have a range of understandings and doings that exceed the capacity I expressed as a mewling infant. But whether or not my transition into old age will represent an advance or degradation is much more dubious. Her Highness Great Nature seems to contain much hierarchy and heterarchy alike. The cosmos is suffused with significant signs of implied progress, but also with great omens of randomness and cyclic behavior. And can randomness progress? Are some cycles higher and deeper than others? Please do not jump to irrational conclusions either way. A slow meandering toward irrational conclusions will be more than adequate. I suppose we are not complete idiots to assume that organisms, in our endless quest to serve the hidden gene teams by whittling our adaptation into particular ecological niches, might periodically stumble upon new frontiers of capacity that perhaps correspond to a more non-local adaptation. Does the audacious evolutionary dynamic of thrival and survival apply also to the niche of the general ontological, metaphysical, and cosmic background of all beings? My own legendary intellectual laziness makes it clear to me that, barring any extra effort on my part, the chronological arrangement of deep historical data presents a picture of the periodic emergence of new regimes of perception, cognition, communication, and energy production, in tandem with an increased range of consciously recognized types of patterns. Although most modern people are not as complex as primitive populations in the richness of their microbiomes or their sensory acuity, nonetheless, if you close one eye and squint, it looks as though we do suffer exposure to a broader set of types of complex patterns. Sure, they can read the waves and winds better than ourselves, but we can, in principle, also get the television fixed, discuss the theory of relativity, and peer through microscopes or gape slack-jawed at the unnatural rigor of nonlinear computations. It may not always be better. It may not always be more in any absolute sense, but something has surely been amplified here. The number of types of things that have to be accounted for socially and cognitively has seemingly quantitatively increased. Huzzah? However, before we break out the gushing champagne of general celebration, let us be clear, at least amongst ourselves, that most organisms do not undergo the particular set of changes that we retrospectively track as an evolutionary increase. The frogs kept being frogs while the monkeys learned to build bombs, and the potassium ions were notably unimpressed. These are not grades of generic advancement, but rather they are increasingly narrow and particular pathways. Using our magical rear view mirror, we see it as only an unfortunate subset of any regime of information energetic organization. that undergoes that form of mutation which we look back upon as the essential steps toward our current and emergingly glorious selves. So part of the essential developmental premise is that fewer and fewer types of beings become structurally capable of encoding larger and larger ranges of reality. It is freakish, elitist, and peculiar, rather than homogeneous and predestined. That does not, however, preclude it from being awesome, and even of being of potential cosmic interest. We might assume even that the seasonal growth of the cosmic tree is notably expressed at the tips of the branches. Of course, these ideas make us sound suspiciously like shamanic primitives. How are we to think about all of this? Ever since the swinging heyday of the Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin, various arrogant psychoanthropologists like myself have tended to describe this narrowing tip of progress as the simultaneous intensification of external structural complexity and internal depth of consciousness. And who could be against that? Eric Chasson proposed that the maximum throughput of energy rate density encoded in a class of beings has constantly increased over the history of the known universe, but of course only among a smaller and smaller percentage of the total universe. Dangerously elitist? Perhaps, but why not take a risk once in a while? The arc notion of complexity, though, bothers me a little bit. Is it really increasing? How do we gauge that? I'm fond of or a fan of certain wild megalomaniacal computational theorists like Stephen Wolfram, whose work suggests that the majority of the patterns in the universe are always already irreducibly complex. In that case, we're not adding complexity so much as we are making it useful, mineable, workable. In a way, we are simplifying it into our sphere of utility, so perhaps it is the simplification that is increasing. I'll place my bets in a hedge and suggest that the narrowly increasing quantity is layered complexity, the degree to which types of complexity are integrated into a functional structure. The notion of the narrowing progress of expanding integrations is nifty, sure. But I get the impression that we get differing impressions if we prime our pumps with diverse thematic and perspectival lenses. Take the cognitivists, for example, and to be fair, let's overlook their quasi-compulsive conflation of the social utility of the waking intellect with the general situational complexity of intelligence. Through their lens, we might hear that every form of abstract categorization can be placed alongside other examples of the same degree of abstract categorization, and then subsumed in an emerging metacategory of even more abstract categorization. Nothing weird about that. Words contain multiple letters, and sentences contain multiple words, and books apparently contain many sentences, I've heard. Fine. The number of different layers of abstract enfolding, perhaps cross-referenced to the speed and reliability with which we can access them, can be construed as the very essence of the series of emergent layers of consciousness within the human psychological realm. On one of your other hands, however, take the hip and hefty lens of the historians. They might say instead that among all the different ways to adapt to new technologies, economies, and ecological conditions, there are a few novel styles that tend to stick and which are then folded into subsequent styles. We adapted to written alphabets and then to print literacy, and then we adapted to digital communication tools that contain various forms of literacy. It was not a growth of meta-categorizations, but rather a relative sequence of adaptive responses to contingent and changing circumstances that, among other things, trace a sequence in which some stable forms are dependent upon others rather than acting as arbitrary alternatives. Morally, though, we might see the sequence still differently. Every form of living, we might say, is potentially excellent if done well in a balanced fashion. But because all living beings are subject to trauma and all societies subject to drift and mission creep, it is extremely difficult to diagnose a system in which you are embedded. And the need to reduce suffering, to establish justice, and restore well-being forces the emergence of people who can view their cultures as if from the outside. The deep moral need to prevent needless misery has to take critical overviews, alien viewpoints, and expanded ranges of time and space into account. We might have a deep urge for a moral eros that favors adaptations which, in hindsight, look like expanding spheres of inclusion. Metaphysically, we might be more than a little inclined to suspect that some spectrum or underlying morphosyntactic structure haunts the cosmos eternally in a way that predisposes otherwise random evolutionary outcomes toward the attractor states of certain qualitatively distinct and level-like systems of being in the world. Since I no longer need my own drift, I hope you get it, which is this general sense that we have numerous different epistemological options for conceiving of a layer-like pattern emerging from the ordinary flux of evolutionary adaptations and mechanical energetic collisions in this so-called cosmos of ours. Alternatively, of course, we might also say that, gosh darn it, reality is just too complex, messy, and multi-tentacled and maddeningly nuanced to ever be well represented by these simplistic human ladders of positive, putative progress, and that we should be hesitant or even antipathic, if that's a word, toward any cookie-cutter categorizations. And doubly so if they sound suspiciously as though the purpose of all history was to make people like us. A fierce battle rages, hair-pulling, spitting, and groin stuff between the advocates of various semi-complementary developmental stage models and, on the other hand, the alarmed adversaries of all such approaches. You will not be surprised, or at least I would be surprised to learn that you were surprised, to learn that I feel sensitively indifferent to both sides of this controversy, and that I typically presume with appropriate aplomb that these concerns conceal a deep functional complementarity. But what are these two sides that I think are secretly on the same side? Well, first, let's round up all those people who do merely have simplistic allergic reactions to any one or any idea that reminds them to psychologically project their own disowned habits of covert narcissism and ranking onto others. We'll ship them out to some camps that are currently under construction. You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, am I right? Meanwhile, let's get to the juicy meat inside the crab shell, because it's going right into that omelet, of seemingly valid complaints. It looks to me like there were basically three rhymes in number, these complaints. One, developmental models are mostly clumsy, lacking nuance, overly general, unwittingly embedded in very particular historical narratives that privilege certain ideological outcomes and hint at the superior status of the model maker or their patrons. Two, discussion of such models, irregardless of the more complex clarifications of certain theorists, is more trouble than it's worth, since it will almost certainly trigger our base instincts for reductive categorization, the very instincts that were so grossly on display during recent periods of historical eugenics, holocausts, and marginalizations. And three, any valid benevolent goals baked into the work of the most seemingly sensitively inclusive theorists are, in fact, and just like a crab omelet, better served by cultivating human depth, compassion, and flexible living relationships than by fixation upon the abstract idea of some developmental system. My view is a horse. And a horse is a horse, of course, so of course we need to take these very valid concerns seriously while validating their seriousness. But it's not totes obvi that this means they are necessarily an attack on developmental schemas in principle. In fact, we could consider them to be specifying the necessary parameters of the specific kinds of developmental models and meta-discourse around developmental models, which would in fact be worth exploring. Conversely, reversely and inversely, but not, I hope, tersely, the pro-developmental theory omelet argument tastes a little something like this. Various kinds of relatively maturational and stage-like thresholds and phases have, in fact, been found by researchers in many different disciplines. And if these form part of our reality, then any science-oriented thinker with integrity should take the risk of acknowledging that fact while studying this and trying to use it for the well-being of creatures like ourselves. 2. There is an enormous social risk, increased with the advent of AI, from societies that perceive human beings as static and homogeneous entities. Just as it is problematic to infantilize a growing child, and equally problematic to pretend that a person is undermined by an old tweet, we must structure our social discourse explicitly around the dynamic possibilities of ongoing human change, growth, maturation, and dare I say it, improvement, if we are going to stand any real chance of cultivating a culture of depth, wisdom, and justice. 3. In order to avoid the dangers of false equivalence between all value systems and worldviews, and however much you might want to avoid marginalizing people, there are some people whose views, if enacted, would be, by your own standard, massively worse than mere marginalization. We have to come together in an open conversation about different worldviews and styles of being in the world so that they negotiate fairly with each other and so that we can all learn to expect, accommodate, and live with people, even if we think they inhabit outdated or crazy paradigms. And 4th, we are each in a better position psychologically to know ourselves, to navigate our changes, and to anticipate our emerging needs if we at least have some access to fairly reliable but open conceptual tools that non-reductively sketch out the typical phases and challenges of human beings across multiple styles of cognition and socialization. So, should we lean into the developmental stage theories or cautiously dispense with them? Yes. These are, or can be, complementary modalities in which people of integrity, excellence, creativity, and curiosity can specialize in different approaches with the same rough telos of diverse, naturalized, multidimensional human well-being and thriving in a regenerative, innovative life world, secured and honored by the best versions of technological civilization. We need people to do good work by putting models aside, and we need people to do good work improving and applying models. If the work is good in both cases, there will be confluence and cross-pollination that produces new and ancient understanding that is deeper than what either group could accomplish on their own. How many times have I said it? The separator is the connector. If I can be, just for a moment, uncharacteristically honest with you, then I might admit that I feel that basic consciousness is a scale-independent phenomenon amplified in the form of every self-organizing system, no matter how tiny, weird, or primordial. Ah, feelings. Now, before you exhaust yourself looking up pantheism in your outdated philosophical dictionary, let me quickly point out that for myself, these tiny, weird, and primordial examples of self-organizing systems, such as atoms and quarks, are largely free from any uniquely human or animal psychology. While it is entirely possible that specific functions associated with personhood are in fact inherited into human beings and all beings from the involutionary syntax of the world, we certainly do not need to fantastically transpose our conventional sense of putatively high-grade socialized self-awareness onto the slugs, bugs, and foaming quantum fields. We might actually assume there's some likely pragmatic threshold beyond which the richness of the subjective interiority of systems is so scant that it might as well be described with a good conscience as no consciousness. According to my outdated dictionary of physics and pirate ships, there's something called a plank, which stipulates that you can only walk so far before you fall off the end. There are obviously smaller and smaller, infinitely receding numbers to describe the eternal itsy-bitsiness of sizes, but once you reach the end of the plank, or some specific ratio thereof, anything you find is now technically too small to matter. The degree to which smaller things exhibit the characteristic properties of matter is at that point so minimal as to be virtually meaningless for discussions of physics or pirate ships. So on the off chance that that made any sense to you, just apply it back to the interiority of self-organizing systems to get my view on the subject. And don't worry, I won't waste your time here describing my view that vanishing infinitesimal structures provide a window onto the constitutive deferral of dynamic relational adjacencies that constitute the nature of ontology itself. Instead, I'll follow you to a public restroom some night and lay it on you then. But in the meanwhile, let's wriggle up through those layer-like emergent regimes that immediately precede the story of human developmental stages. Here's the story. Once upon a time, there sort of lived crystals and viruses. They weren't alone, but they symbolize in retrospect an ultra-archaic and ongoing hinterland in which it is tricksy as hobbits to decide if they're really alive or whether they are, as the paleobiologists say, really not alive. This fuzziness, this meandering beach between the mechanical ocean of minerals and the luscious land of life represents a startling and intriguing regime shift that occurred on at least one planet. Gorgeous Horuses and sets of geological molecules forged in the ancient hearts of stars started producing and becoming absorbed into the very essence of autopoietic and symbiotic ecologies of evolving reproductive organisms. What an odd thing to do, said Terence Deacon of the United Naturalistic Church of No Saints. That's some frisky dirt, said a spokesman for the Ken Wilber Ecological Reserve and Limited Big Game Hunting Park. Personally, I'm not sure it's ethical to let them hunt those animals, but I did grow up rural, so I kind of get it as long as it's sporting and they eat what they kill. Anyhoozles, this guy, or maybe gal, named the Gaian Web, spread wide open over the slowly changing surface of the geological world and took mineral molecules into the within of its many interdependent bodies. These bodies were learning the neat trick of regulated transmogrification. They were growing because they were able to structurally capture sequences of repeatable changes in their own histories through the use of reciprocal and oppositional processes operating between self-organizing subsystems, like we all do sometimes. Anyhoozles, part 2, these integrated communities of cellular, viral, and bacterial self-transforming superstructures were infused with and dependent upon and basically enveloped, or enveloped as some tomatoes say, their mineral and chemical substrates. Being something of a conformist, I refer to these as sentient or sensitive, evaluative, overtly preference-bearing beings. Although we do not know all the kinds of things that might emerge from complex geological interactions, we know that at least a small subset of those systems can sometimes temporarily fold themselves inside out into being beings. It happened. Get over it. But don't forget that maybe other things could have happened. And why did it happen? Well, either A, randomly, or B, because something, or C, because something influences randomliness. Personally, if pushes came to shoves, I might choose C, but possibly only because a few homophones in my head are still thinking about pirates walking those planks. Damn homos! And I'm not crazy about sapiens either. Now, where were we in our wonderful story of developmental stages? Yes, we'd reached the vegetable part. Vegetative sentient organisms can become very intelligent. Slime molds and mycelial communities are notable examples. What contemporary socialized humans charmingly refer to as the plants form a vast interactive complexity of reciprocally regulated processes of electrochemical transformation which would make the world literally worth living in. These eyeless creeps invented and maintained stuff like soil, sex, death, and breathable air. I love that stuff. My hat goes off to them, even though they can't even make one electric hat making machine. I forgive them and I respect them. Although I do kill them and eat them in rather astonishing numbers, but I guess that's okay because their little voices are too quiet for my big ears to hear their screams, and thus my ancestors never evolved an ethical instinct about that. There are vast numbers of truly strange organisms existing at different scales and in different environments. We've barely scratched the surface of the biodiversity of plant life on this planet, and there are probably even better ways to study it than scratching. Think how many vegetative network species you have never seen and might not even recognize, and are lost even to the genocides of deep history or are thriving on even crazier worlds than this one. I know you think you're into diversity because you didn't attend that rally against transgender bathrooms, but seriously, folks, our prosaic and provincial notion of the plants will undoubtedly have to be radically broadened and generalized considerably in order to be thought of as telling us anything useful about the cosmos. Welcome to woke botany, bitches. And wouldn't you know it, a small subset of these symbiotic communities of organisms, probably the ones who had initially been getting a lot of flack and even a little guff for wasting their time tinkering with a relatively standardized genetic toolkit for quick adaptive reconfigurations, got some kind of advantage or else found an easy cosmic probability slant and converged their protean trajectories into another new regime. Just as bacteria and vegetation incorporated minerals into their body envelopes, some of these boobies mutated stably into an ultra peculiar form that enfolded many plant-like organism systems together as organs inside a skin sac. With the help of spinal scaffolding upcycled from intercellular mineral waste deposits, various the plants slowly reorganized themselves into neuromobile gardens, known colloquially and retrospectively as the animals. And if we didn't have to pay for it, this is where we would play We Gotta Get Out of This Place from Eric Burden and the Animals.